Communism Combat will be speaking to Ruki Fernando from Sri Lanka, a young, brave human rights defender, writer, activist and journalist who's even had to seek asylum away from his country shortly, has now returned and is at the forefront of the justice reconciliation struggle. Hi Ruki, thanks so much. Just wanted a brief introduction to your work, the work that you do in Sri Lanka.
So I'm based in Colombo, the capital, but much of my work has to do with the north and to a lesser extent with the east, the areas that were most affected with the war. So I work with families of disappeared people, I work with victims of torture, detainees and families of those who have been detained on political reasons, journalists who had been detained, arrested, and I also worked on protecting people, particularly journalists and human rights defenders, but also civilians who have been at risk, facing life threats. Most of them have opted to go abroad at some point, and I had helped in that relocation. In the last couple of months after the change of the government, I had the pleasure of trying to work with some of them who wanted to come back, which itself was quite difficult. And I've also worked generally on awareness raising about the human rights situation, particularly in the southern, western parts of the country, sharing experiences of what's going on in the north and east with Sinhalese communities in other parts of the country, but also sharing what's going on in Sri Lanka with the international communities. So at the moment, the primary organization I work with is Inform Human Rights Documentation Center. Before I work with Law and Society Trust, also based in Colombo. But in addition to that, I work with a number of other people, other networks of journalists, of disappeared people, of families of political detainees and religious clergy, lawyers, and so forth.
Sri Lanka saw a terrible period when the entire war against, so-called war against the terror in the north was unleashed. And did you find there was adequate support from India?
Yes, I think there was quite a lot of interest and concern in different parts of India. But I also think that sometimes in some parts of India like Tamil Nadu, there needs to be a little bit more objective assessment of what's going on and not to be too carried away by emotions alone. But by and large, there has been lots of interest in India.
How grave is the situation today?
Well, the situation today since 8th of January is much better and looks a bit more hopeful than it was till 2014 when it was very, very bleak. I think more human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, clergy who are active in human rights, social justice areas feel more free. We feel that we have more space to talk and we have less to fear. Of course, we hope that that will be there for continuously for several years, but at the moment we are experiencing some form of freedom. There has been less acts of grabbing land, which the military has been doing in particular for the last several years. There has been no abductions, disappearances that have been reported in the last 5 months. So I think, and there have been some positive legislative processes that have been initiated. We passed a constitutional amendment called the 19th Amendment, which made the president's powers less. So he's less of a powerful executive president and more accountable to parliament and to people.
That is quite an achievement.
Yes, and the 19th Amendment also re-established independent institutions which were there once, but which were taken away by something called the 18th Amendment to the Constitution by the Rajapaksa time. Yeah. So again, that's another positive thing. We passed a Victim and Witness Protection Act, and we are...
All this in the space of 5.5 months?
Yes, and we are in the process of passing a Right to Information Act, about which there have been some consultations with different stakeholders, which is a positive thing. So there have been quite a few positive things that have happened. There has been a little bit of land that was occupied by the military previously, distributed back to their rightful owners. So there has been quite a lot of positive things happening. But I don't want to be saying that everything is perfect, because we have major challenges ahead. One major thing is a political solution to the ethnic conflict, which will address the root causes of the conflict. What we've been addressing is more the effects and the consequences of the conflict. There was no talk about it during the presidential election campaign by any of the candidates, and there was no talk about it after the elections in the last 5 months or so. That remains to be done. We need to find ways of dealing with the past, the terrible abuses, violations that have happened, particularly dealing with reconciliation and accountability. And we need to find ways of cooperating and taking forward some of the measures that have been taken at the international level in particular, without discarding them totally. And we haven't really had serious discussions about those things. So I think we still have lots of challenges that still face us.
What actually took Sri Lanka back so much? And do you think the forces that made that happen have been convincingly defeated, or can they rear their heads again?
Well, they were defeated convincingly at the presidential elections. 81% of Sri Lankan voters turned out, which was quite impressive and historic. And I think the main reason that such a large number turned out, unlike before, was to say that this is enough. We've had enough of the Rajapaksas. And what we had actually was that the Rajapaksa family capturing the total state. They captured the judiciary, they captured the legislation, and they captured the media, they captured to some extent even some NGOs and civil society by co-opting them. So it was total capture of the state, all organs of the state. So I think recovering from that will take some time. But I think we are starting, and we are trying hard to start.
You said many journalists and rights defenders who had sought asylum outside are now wanting to come back. How many had actually had to go away, and how many are likely to come back?
Well, I don't know the exact number, but I think the number has been estimated at like something like 80 during the time of the Rajapaksas. So I can't vouch for the number. But personally, I've been involved in at least relocation of at least 20 people personally. So there are a lot more than that. And I think it's too early for many of them to come back, because there is still a slight risk that the Rajapaksas have some power and they could still do some harm to them, even though they are not directly in power. So therefore, I think many will want to wait and see, at least till the parliamentary elections will happen. But personally, I know that 2 of my friends and colleagues are going to come back in July. 3 have already come back end of April. But also, I think it's about the new government has rhetorically said that everyone is welcome to come back. But I think they need to go beyond rhetoric and do some concrete things, specific things to enable people who have gone into exile to come back.
What kind of steps?
Well, I think they need to have something like a focal point within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something like that, so that people who want to come back or their families can contact them easily with the email, telephone number, Skype, everything like that available, and someone who can talk in all 3 languages. They also need to look at the financial aspect of it. Some of those people will not have enough money even to come back to buy a ticket. Some may need some assistance for the first couple of months because they won't be employed immediately. Then they need to look at providing jobs to make sure that, particularly those journalists who had worked in state media who went into exile. So when they come back, the option of them getting back their jobs, which they lost to no fault of their own, should be looked at. There are some people who have charges against them pending, arrest warrants, so some of them could be arrested. So I think there should be assurances that those things are withdrawn, and if there are legitimate reasons for those investigations to go on and for arrest, there should be clear assurances that those things will be done according to due process and rule of law. And also I think it's important to create an enabling environment, that the people should feel that there is safety and that there is an environment where they can operate freely. To some extent that is there in the first 5 months, but that has to be consolidated after the parliamentary elections. And I think another important dimension is that some of those people who had gone abroad into exile are people who actually were attacked physically, who got death threats, and they have made complaints about it to local bodies. And I think those complaints have to be looked into at least now. And it's only when impunity against attacks on the media and freedom of expression is tackled that many of the journalists who are in exile will feel like coming back.
Have you been personally under threat?
I've been threatened several times in the past. I myself went into exile for some short period, and then I thought I'll come back. But even when I came back, I have been subjected to interrogation several times. I've been followed, subjected to surveillance, and I was also arrested and detained on anti-terror charges. Even till today, there is an investigation going on against me based on the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and there is a restriction on my freedom of expression, and there is a restriction on overseas travel.
But you still continue without...
I still continue. Yeah.
Do you feel, Ruki, that the Asia solidarity that we should have for each other's issues, for human rights defenders, journalists, writers, bloggers, anybody who faces threats from within their government, do you feel it's adequate?
I think it's not adequate. I think it will never be adequate. But I think as Sri Lankans, I personally have experienced lots of support and solidarity. When I had to go into exile, there were many Asian friends who called me and said, "You're welcome to come here and stay as long as you want." And they actually made me feel very comfortable. Some of them offered me accommodation, tickets and all that. And many others in India, in Nepal, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in many countries in Asia, in Sri Lankan human rights defenders and journalists who are at risk have been welcome and have been hosted. But I think what is missing is clear Asian government support. So that I think still needs to be done. And I think we need to explore it a little bit more to formalize some of these things because the sheer extent of threats against human rights defenders, journalists in Asia is very high. So it's very difficult for individuals or NGOs alone to deal with it. So I think we need to approach maybe some cities where there might be positive interest to host and have things like shelter cities in Asia, maybe some Asian universities which can run some fellowship programs for human rights defenders at risk from within Asia. So some of them would have also opportunities to do slightly longer term programs like 2-3 years and to further their academic competence and or to gain some new skills. So I think we need to go a little bit beyond the ad hoc interventions that good-willed individuals and good-willed NGOs have been doing.
Now that there's been this positive change in Sri Lanka, the winds of change now need to get into the question of a political solution. How can that happen?
I think all communities need to look at themselves and their own community. I need to look at my own community, and Tamils also need to look at their own community and recognize what has been done, the bad things that have been done in their name by the LTT and by other armed groups. The Muslims also need to look into their own community and see particularly about their silence on certain situations when bad things are being done to the Tamils. So everyone needs to look at their own community. I think that's very important. And also I think there has to be a stronger effort to work with the Sinhalese community, political leaders, religious leaders, academics, artists, media, I think activists. We all need to reach out to the Sinhalese community and to talk with them about the ideas of power sharing, devolution, address fears, whether they are genuine fears or whether they are perceived fears that are not realistic. We still need to address them. I think we need to try to depend less on the international community in terms of finding a political solution and work more with different communities and individuals in Sri Lanka.
Do you find enough younger activists joining the same kind of
Yes, I think there are many young activists that I have worked with, and I am optimistic. And I think particularly in the last presidential elections, we saw a lot of young activists. But it's certainly not enough. Our universities, our schools don't have enough spaces for young people to engage in human rights activism or social justice initiatives. So I think it has to, schools and universities have to create spaces. Not everyone will find spaces on their own. But we have some very young, smart lawyers. We have some young journalists who are very brave and very courageous, who dare to report the truth and share their opinions as they had it. And we had some, just before the presidential elections, there was a young group of artists calling themselves New Generation of Artists who came forward. So I think there is hope that more young people will get involved in human rights activism.
So such a pleasure talking to you, Ruki. Thank you very much.
Pleasure also, and thank you very much.